But now that we have all the risks down, we can actually look at the hearts and look more into how it actually functions. So we know what can damage it and whatnot. Now we're actually going to look at it and look at the physiology of it. So this is a beautiful picture of the heart that I just drew right now, free-handed. And there's two main formulas that you have to know. And by this point, you know the heart's anatomy, whatever, all this yellow stuff is plaque, so that's usually not there. That's what heart disease is, causing all this plaque. But essentially you have this guy, the left ventricle, and he's pumping out a majority of the blood throughout the body. And as such, the left ventricle is exponentially stronger than the right ventricle because it's responsible for pumping blood throughout the whole body. But now let's focus more on equations. So there's two main equations for the cardiovascular system that you will see over and over again and you will fall in love with and you know everything about. The first equation is heart rate times stroke volume equals cardiac output. And what this means is this is essentially the strength of the heart. Heart rate, everyone knows what that is. That's a beating of the heart. That's the blood flow through the heart, and when the heartbeat is done, it pumps blood throughout the whole body. So heart rate is measured in beats per minute. It's very simple. You can measure it. You can hear your heart beat. Stroke volume is how much blood the left ventricle pumps out with every single beat, and that's usually measured in milliliters. So every time the heart pumps, or every time the heart beats, it pumps out a certain volume of blood throughout the left ventricle, and that volume that's pumped out of the left ventricle is called the stroke volume. Obviously, the higher stroke volume, that means it's much more efficient, you're pumping out much more blood. Cardiac output is measured in either liters per minute or milliliters per minute. And you can tell that just by looking at the formulas, beats per minute, milliliters, multiply, and you're going to get liters per minute or milliliters per minute. And what this is this is the total volume of blood. And you can probably guess what it equals based on the formula, beats per minute. So every time the heart beats, it pumps out a certain volume of blood, and it equals cardiac output. So cardiac output must be the total volume of blood that's pumped out every minute. Blood pumped every minute. So this is the total amount of blood that the left ventricle pumps out every minute, and it's also the total amount of blood that the body has circulating every minute. Since whatever the left ventricle pumps out, that's what's circulating in the body because you don't lose any blood in the body. So this is how much blood is circulating your body every single minute. And that can be 5 liters, 10 liters, all the way up to 30 liters. So that's a lot of blood. So essentially your body is circulating around 30 liters of blood at maximal exercise if you're an elite athlete every single minute. It's a whole lot of blood. So since that's one formula, that measures the strength of a heart. Heart rate times stroke volume equals cardiac output. The more in shape you are, the higher cardiac output will be when you start exercising. When you start exercising, your body needs more blood because your muscles need more blood and oxygen. So it'll increase its blood flow and how much blood it pumps out, and thus your cardiac output will start increasing when you exercise. But we'll go over all that in more detail in later videos. So that's one formula. The other formula is the Vo2 Max formula, or also called the Fick equation. It's Vo2 equals cardiac output times something called AV difference. Now cardiac output we just went over, it's heart rate times stroke volume, so you can just simplify that out to heart rate times stroke volume if you want. It doesn't matter. So what that's saying is if she asks us a question that says VO2 equals cardiac output times AV difference, that's true. But she also says VO2 equals heart rate times stroke volume times AV difference, that's also true. It's the same exact thing. Now what this is VO2 is a very important number. In the medical community, VO2 is considered the single indicator of cardiovascular strength. If you have a high VO2, you're extremely fit, your heart is strong, your prognosis for living is very, very good. If you have a low VO2, like below 20 or something, your heart is very, very weak, your cardiovascular system is weak, and your prognosis for living is thus very low, like less than 5 years, or your quality of life is very decreased. So yeah, your quality of life. This whole class is about quality of life, trying to improve your quality of life. A shitty quality of life will be like running out of breath walking upstairs. Normal activity, can't do it, quality of life is terrible. And the VO2 is probably terrible because the cardiovascular system is so weak. So if you have a low VO2, you have a very low quality of life. So VO2 can kind of be synonymous with quality of life. Quality of life. And this is the most important term in medical terminology. That's what health professionals and exercise physiologists agree on. There's certain things they don't agree on with exercise, and that's a whole nother topic of why I don't really like the medical community. But VO2 as the single most indicator of quality of life, they do agree on that because it's such an important number. So that's just VO2 equals cardiac output times AV difference. And now what VO2 actually is how much oxygen. It's either measured in milliliters or liters also. So it's milliliters of oxygen that your cells can use, or what do you say, body. So you put body can use. Okay, so every time you breathe in a certain volume of oxygen, and it circulates your bloodstream when you pump out your blood with your stroke volume and whatnot. So it circulates in your bloodstream, and your body and your capillaries uptakes a certain volume of oxygen. Well, the body isn't as efficient as we want to believe. It only takes maybe like 5%, 10%, 40% of that oxygen that's available. So why does it only take such a low amount of oxygen when there's such an abundance of oxygen? The reason for that is because of certain things in training change that, makes your body stronger, but your body just isn't as efficient, so it doesn't take all the oxygen. And VO2 is a number that tells you how much oxygen your body is actually using. So a higher VO2 means your body's using much more oxygen. And these can range anywhere from 10, it's always measured in milliliters per kilogram per minute. Well, there's another thing, this is called a relative VO2, which I'm sure you know by now. And it can range all the way to 90. There's been a few recording instances of 90, which 90 is like all the way up there. It's extremely high. That person's extremely in shape. They're elite. They're probably a cross-country skier or something. No runner has been recorded that high, but cross-country skiers, a pure aerobic activity where their sport depends on oxygen, it's probably 90. Now 10 means your prognosis for living is very, 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 very low, and your quality of life is very, very low. You probably don't have too much longer to live unless you really strengthen your cardiovascular system. But this is the range usually. A normal individual, everyone in this class is probably like 40 to 50. If you're a runner, it might be 60, 70, and 80, so it's entering the elite field. But it's quality of life. Now this means they can only take up 10 milliliters of oxygen per minute based on their body weight. This means 90 kilograms per minute based on body weight. That's a lot of oxygen. So it's much better. So these are the two formulas. AV difference is just the difference. This class doesn't really focus too much on AV difference, but AV difference is essentially how much the volume of oxygen in your arteries minus the volume of oxygen in your veins. You want it to be bigger because if the difference is bigger, that means you're taking up more oxygen. I wouldn't focus on that too much. Just know the formula and know a higher VO2 is much better. So now that we know these two formulas, we can play around with them a little bit and see like when they decrease and when they raise, what exercise does to these different values, what training does to them versus pre-train versus post-train, which we'll hit in other videos because that's a big topic. But essentially the one that you have to know is what happens with heart rate when you're laying down versus when you're standing. Laying versus standing. So how it works is your heart's a muscle, it pumps out a certain volume of blood and it beats a certain amount of times per minute. Now, depending on your anatomical position, whether you're laying or standing, your heart is stressed differently, so it has different requirements to live up to. Now, if you're laying down, what happens is the majority of your blood, because of gravity, the majority of your blood is in your torso. So blood pools in your torso because of gravity. And you can see that. You can think about that if you're laying down, you don't have gravity pushing blood to your legs. So gravity is pushing the blood into your torso, or it's pooling in your torso region. Now, obviously, we need blood to get to our legs because that's also important. The muscles, they need blood. So how would you get more blood to your legs? Would your heart beat faster? Well, if your heart beats faster, it doesn't matter if gravity is pushing in your torso. You just have more blood in your torso in a faster beating heart. So what it would do is your stroke volume would increase. And your stroke volume is how much blood you pump out with every beat. So stroke volume can really be measured as the intensity of force. If your stroke volume increases, you have much more force propelling that blood throughout your body out of your left ventricle. So with all that force, it will push the blood to your legs. So your stroke volume will increase in order to kind of go against gravity because it has gravity working against resistance. It goes against the resistance of gravity to get blood to your legs. And since your stroke volume is increasing, one more thing that we should definitely hit first is cardiac output is the same for everyone at rest. Everyone has a cardiac output of 5 to 6 liters per minute at rest. The reason being because The body over millions of years of not millions of years, I don't know, but over years of evolution has adapted to where it only needs 5 to 6 liters of blood circulating its body at rest. That's all it requires. Regardless of how in shape you are, you still need the same amount of blood at rest because you're still performing the same amount of tasks. So you can be an elite athlete, Usain Bolt, whatever. That's a bad example. He's not a really endurance athlete, but an elite athlete, Ryan Hall, Olympic marathoner, whatever. And you require a lot. You have much higher cardiac output when you're exercising, but at rest you require the same amount of blood as someone who just sits on the couch all day. So it's the same thing. So everyone has the same cardiac output at rest. So that's very important. So seeing how cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume, if cardiac output is always 5 liters per minute, so let's say this is always 5 liters per minute. If stroke volume is increasing, you want to keep the same cardiac output. So heart rate has to decrease. Heart rate can't increase also, because if it increases, cardiac output will increase based on proportions. If heart rate stays the same, cardiac output will still increase. So heart rate has to decrease to offset it so cardiac output stays the same exact. Because again, you're resting, you need the same amount of blood as an elite athlete. Now when you're standing, now blood is no longer focused in the torso. Now because of gravity, blood is getting down to the legs. So blood is reaching the legs, So that kind of solves this problem. You no longer need the higher stroke volume to forcibly push blood because you have no resistance of gravity keeping blood from hitting the legs. So stroke volume will decrease. Now, based on that formula, remember, well, cardiac output is always 5 liters per minute. You can guess what happens. If cardiac output is still 5 liters per minute, you still need the same amount of blood, regardless of what, because you're still resting, you're just standing. You still need the same amount of blood, though. Your organs require the same amount of oxygen, nutrients. If your stroke volume is decreasing, you can guess what happens to your heart rate. If you said your heart rate increases, you're correct. Heart rate increases, your stroke volume decreases, thus you keep the same cardiac output. So when you're laying, and you can easily test this, you just lay down. If you lay down, your heart rate will decrease. Your heart rate gets slow when you lay down versus when you're standing. You can't really measure your stroke volume unless you, like, I don't know, insert a catheter or a needle into your heart or cut out your heart or something. Now, most people don't want to do that, but just take my word for it that your stroke volume is increasing when you're laying down. If your heart rate is ever lower, your stroke volume is increased. So when you're laying down, you can easily see your heart rate is lower. Just test it. So if you have this question on test, just think, oh, what happens when I lay down? My heart rate does get lower, so my stroke volume must get higher to maintain that same cardiac output. And when you're standing, your heart rate increases, you know that. So your stroke volume must decrease to keep that same cardiac output. So now we'll just very quickly go over some basic terms to make everything else flow much easier. And these are just pretty much definitions of what is systolic blood pressure, what is diastolic blood pressure, what is something called mean arterial pressure, got pulse pressure, and you have something called rate pressure product. So a lot of abbreviations. But again, everyone I'm sure has seen these abbreviations, or at least these two abbreviations definitely, because they're very common. These two abbreviations are blood pressure. Systolic blood pressure, like when you take someone's blood pressure of 120/80, this is systolic, this is diastolic. What systolic is it measures the pressure of blood when your heart contracts. Now, you know when your heart contracts, it pushes blood throughout the aorta and the arteries, so it pushes blood out the left ventricle. Now, to understand blood pressure, I have another video on it, but essentially your arteries are closed tubes. You have this blood flowing through the tube. The pressure is what it creates on the walls. That's what blood pressure is essentially, the pressure you have on the walls of your arteries. So systolic blood pressure is the highest pressure when your heart pumps blood out. The reason it's so high is because when your heart first pumps blood throughout the aorta, it's a really high pressure because it's forcibly being pumped out the aorta. So this will be very high. So this is the pressure when the heart contracts. So pressure when the heart contracts, or on contraction. Or the technical term for when the heart contracts is called systole. Very simple, systolic blood pressure systole. That's when the heart contracts. That's what the phase is called, is systole. Diastole, this, is the pressure when the heart's relaxing. Now, once the heart contracts, it has to relax in order to fill up with blood. And when we go over the next video will be on the blood flow in the heart and the whatever, the anatomy and whatnot. And this will make sense. Diastole is when the heart is resting. The heart contracts, it has to rest in order to fill up with blood in between heartbeats. Take your pulse on your brachial artery, between whatever, on your brachial artery, and you will feel your heart contract. You will feel your heart contracting when it beats. That's systolic. When you feel the beat, and when it's relaxed, that little pause is the relaxation. That's diastole, when it's filling up with blood. So that's always called diastole. Mean arterial pressure is just simple formula. There's two ways to measure it. You have cardiac output times total peripheral resistance. Total peripheral resistance is just the size of the arteries. Don't worry about this formula. It's invasive. So probably, I don't know, just know that formula. But it's an invasive formula. You don't really measure it. The other formula that you need to know for case studies in order to calculate on someone, and also for life, is you can easily calculate this by just giving some numbers or measuring someone's blood pressure. It's 1/3 their diastolic blood pressure minus their systolic blood pressure. So this number minus this number. And then you plus your diastolic blood pressure also. And that's mean arterial pressure. Mean arterial pressure is the medium, well, it says in the name. Mean arterial pressure, the average pressure in the circulatory system. Systolic blood pressure is when the heart first contracts. Diastolic pressure is when it's resting. Mean arterial pressure is the average pressure in the whole arterial system. So it's 1/3 minus systolic minus diastolic. Or another formula is 1/2 minus diastolic, or diastolic minus systolic plus diastolic. Now there's two different formulas because there's two different times we'd use it. If there's a case study and the client's blood pressure is below 100, you would use the 1/3. If there's a case study and the client's pressure is above 100, you would use this formula. Because mean arterial pressure is the average pressure. So if someone's heart rate is faster than 100 beats per minute, you would use 1/2. Not quite sure why, but you would use 1/2 because I can't explain the exact reason right now. So you just know these two formulas based on the situation. If their blood pressure, if their heart rate is higher than 100, or if the heart rate is lower than 100, you would use different formulas. Pulse pressure product is a very simple thing to calculate it. It's just systolic blood pressure minus diastolic blood pressure. Very simple. In this case, it'll be 40. So again, it's just taking systolic minus diastolic. It's a very simple thing to measure. You should never get that question wrong on a case study. Rate pressure product is very important also, kind of like VO2. It's similar to VO2, where VO2 is the strength of your cardiovascular system based on how much oxygen you're uptaking. Rate pressure product is kind of the same thing also. But it's just a different way to look at the same thing. So rate pressure product is an indirect measure of oxygen consumption on the heart. So the higher rate pressure product is, that means your heart is using more oxygen to beat. The lower it is your heart's using less oxygen. So if you're resting, it'll be low because your heart's using very low amount of oxygen, versus if your heart is very stressed, like during intense exercise, it's very high. Now, unlike VO2, where a higher VO2 is always good, a higher rate pressure product is not technically always good. Because if your rate pressure product is very stressed, very high, that means your heart is very stressed and it's using a lot of oxygen. That necessarily is not good, and means it's just necessarily not good. So rate pressure product, indirect measure of oxygen consumption. Memorize as heart rate times systolic blood pressure divided by 100. So it's very simple by looking at all the formulas, what they do, or how to calculate them, what will raise them. If your heart rate is increased and your systolic blood pressure is increased, your heart rate would never increase without your systolic increasing also. Just because heart rate is how fast your heart beats, systolic is the pressure on when your stroke volume, or the pressure in your arteries when your heart beats. So if your heart is beating faster, your systolic will naturally be higher. So if your heart rate is increased with exercise, it will increase your rate pressure product because of proportions. And really, there's no formula for rate pressure product. It's just this calculation. Because you got beats per minute, milliliters of mercury. There's really no formula when you multiply those together, or unit. So if you have a higher heart rate, your rate pressure product is greater. If you have a higher systolic blood pressure, your rate pressure product is bigger. rate pressure product is not always good. If it's extremely high, that just means your heart is very, very stressed. So another way you can, like a synonym for this instead of indirect measure, is the stress on the heart, which I think is a very good synonym. I think it's a very good thing to know. Stress on the heart. So the higher your rate pressure product is, the more your heart is stressed. You really don't want your heart being stressed unless you're like doing maximal exercise. But these are just simple things to memorize, and I'm sure you can't even read what the hell I wrote on this. But they're just very simple things to memorize. And based on these things, now we'll look at how exercise affects all of these versus maximal exercise versus relative, absolute, all that stuff. Okay, we'll go back to the beautiful heart that I drew.